In order to understand the mind, we've opened our minds. To see what hasn't been glimpsed, to break through into new levels of discovery, we ask questions that drive research today so that it may become the cures of tomorrow. We are explorers who delve into the most complex structure known to man so that our most challenging questions can be solved. And committed to discover the treatments that turn mental illness into mental health. We envision a day when Alzheimer's is a distant memory, when autism is just another human variation, when depression is overcome, addictions are released, and a paradigm shift in beliefs erases the pain of stigma. We are at the forefront of grasping the biology of genius and creativity and the complex links between the mind and body. Bringing together extraordinary minds across disciplines, interacting to find the answers that can heal our most human challenges, and training the next generation to go even further. This is the center of a revolution in neuroscience. Here, we strive to open our minds even further. Because we must.
Hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Davidson, the president-elect for UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute. Welcome to tonight's Open Mind program featuring Jaime Lowe and her book Mental, Lithium, Love, and Losing My Mind. Thank you, Ms. Lowe, for being with us this evening, and thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you also to our Open Mind Community Film and Lecture Series Committee, to our board and advisory board members, as well as our executive liaison, Wendy Kelman, for your dedicated work always and in planning our 2019-2020 speaker series. Before I formally introduce tonight's author, Jaime Lowe, Dr. Mark D'Antonio, our UCLA faculty discussant, and our moderator, Julie Robinson, I'd briefly like to provide some details about our organization. The Friends of the Semel Institute is the philanthropic volunteer board and the support group for the world-renowned Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, one of the leading centers for the study of the mind, brain, and behavior. Our mission is to improve the lives of people affected by mental illness by supporting research to advance innovative treatments and sponsoring educational programs like tonight's event to raise awareness and reduce the discrimination of living with and seeking help for mental health concerns. For those of you here for the first time, tonight's program is part of our Open Mind Community Film and Lecture Series that brings together thought leaders in culture and science to present educational programs about mental health issues and the mysteries of the mind and brain as a free public service to our community. We're able to do this thanks to the support of audience members like you. Think NPR or public television. As is the practice of many organizations, we're in the midst of our end-of-year fundraising campaign. In the spirit of the holidays and of giving, if you feel that our programs are worthwhile and provide an important service to the community, we hope you'll consider becoming a member of our Open Mind community and make a donation to support our work. Your donation makes an immediate and important impact by supporting groundbreaking research scholar grants here at UCLA and helping with the expenses incurred, of course, with our speaker events. You can contribute by picking up a white envelope, donation envelope on your way out this evening, or by visiting our website, friendsofthesemilinstitute.org, where you'll also find a calendar of our upcoming events at which we hope to see you all. You may have noticed some chairs are marked reserved, so donations of $100 or more secure your seat at each Open Mind event to which you pre-register for the entire year's speaker series. Our next events will be in January, Thursday, January 9th, featuring Ann Harrington discussing her book Mind Fixers, Psychiatry's Troubled Search for the Biology of Mental Illness, and then Wednesday, January 22nd, featuring Barbara Natterson Horowitz discussing her book Wildhood, The Epic Journey from Adolescence to Adulthood. Now for some details about tonight. First, could you please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent mode so you can be fully present to accept the gifts of the program from the speakers tonight that we are so grateful to receive. Ms. Lowe will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes and then lead directly into a moderated discussion. Tonight, we'll take questions directly from the audience. So please try to formulate your specific question, and we'll circulate a microphone and try to get to as many as possible in the time that we have. Following the discussion, Ms. Lowe will be available to sign her book, which could really make a good holiday gift. Now for our introductions. Our featured speaker, Jaime Lowe, is the author of 2 books, Mental, a memoir about lithium and bipolar disorder, and about which, of course, we'll hear tonight, and Digging for Dirt, The Life and Death of ODB, a biography of Old Dirty Bastard, a founding member of the Wu-Tang Clan. Last August, Lowe reported an hour-long piece on trauma therapy called 10 Sessions for This American Life. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine and the New York Times. She's working on her 3rd book, Breathing Fire, a nonfiction narrative about female inmate firefighters. Dr. Mark D'Antonio, our faculty discussant, is a professor of clinical psychiatry and director of the inpatient child and adolescent psychiatric services at the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital here at UCLA. Julie Robinson, founder and CEO of Literary Affairs, will serve as our moderator. Julie Robinson is, above all, a lover of literature, a woman with an incredible mind, and my friend. As the founder of and creative force behind Literary Affairs, Julie's passion has influenced thousands of readers across Los Angeles through her company's work facilitating over 50 monthly book clubs all over the city, and she is now also amplifying the voices of authors writing on the subject of mental health concerns. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Ms. Jaime Lowe, followed by our moderated discussion with Dr. Mark D'Antonio and Ms. Julie Robinson.
Hi. Super impressed that everyone made it out on Tuesday night. Thank you for coming. And thank you to the Friends of Semel, and to Julie and Dr. D'Antonio for being here and doing this with me. Sorry. Out of all the places to speak, this is definitely by far the most significant to me. I was diagnosed here. I was hospitalized here in this building. I was diagnosed by Dr. D'Antonio. And I think if I told 16-year-old me that I would be addressing an audience to talk about my life, she'd probably say, of course, duh. Because I was 16 and I was experiencing grand delusions. And that totally would have made sense to me. I don't think I realized how charged it would be to come back to this place. But seeing the windows and the brick and the hoops of the recreational therapy just past over there, It brings back a lot of memories, some pretty bad memories, actually. Being here was one of the hardest times of my life, but it was also where I got a diagnosis and medication and help. From this exact place, I was able to grow and function and live. I was lucky I landed here. I can't speak without crying, so I'm sorry. It's also a little bit of a part of the Depressive, I think. I'm going to blame it on that. Okay, breathing. Anyway, I was lucky I landed here, and I'm really grateful to be here today, and I'm really grateful that you are all here too. So I'm going to just read the first chapter of the book, which was what was happening prior to being here in this very place, at this very building. Okay. It's kind of an intense chapter. Where was that nugget of old, dried up shit weed I bought on Venice Boardwalk 2 years ago from a vagrant dealer who may or may not have sold me a thimble full of dirt mixed with oregano? I pounded on the volume button of my Costco special Magnavox stereo. It was pulsating in syncopation with my anxiety. Cacophony doesn't describe it. It was so loud I could feel it traveling from my heels to my outer cranium, taking in the itching, the scratching, the clawing, the gridlock of atonal chords. It was loud, and I needed it to be. I could feel the chorus like combat, and I could deflect the harmony. Angels and peace and major chords weren't welcome, just the loud, cheap stereo behind my slammed shut door. Where was it? Where was it? Where? I knew it was somewhere. The chords crashed on top of each other. I could see them. I could see the waves of sound cascading from speaker to skin. I could taste them. It was not under my mattress or tucked into a corner of my pink floral Laura Ashley sheets, a present from my bat mitzvah. It was not in my jewelry box that my paternal grandparents, Oma and Opa, had given me when they traveled to Austria. The jewelry box, not the weed, had a tiny ballet dancer on a rusted metal gear that would spring to life and pirouette to canned music every time the lid was cracked. The lid was not cracked, and the tiny dancer was crushed under a different sound, suffocating. Where was the nugget? Where was the nugget? Where was that nickel bag of shitweed? I bought it. I smoked it once on a Friday afternoon when no one was home. I felt nothing but fire in my throat, swallowing red-hot embers. I was good. I was great. I was perfect all the time, but now I needed that chunk of bullshit weed so that I could get out of this terrifying place with no windows, out of this castle of chords crashing down on me, a wall of terror collapsing onto my skull the way they had wanted it to. I had to get out, away from my tulip sheets, away from my delicate jewelry box, and very far away from my mask collection, the lips that moved in the night. It was subtle. I could see it. Those faces had something to say and would not shut the fuck up. I hear you. I'm sorry for the cursing. I hear you now. I am listening to you. I am leaving. The popcorn tin. It was in the tin that once held caramel cheddar and butter and sat next to a life-size penguin in our living room, my things that no one needed to know anything about, behind my tiny rocking chair and Boo-Boo Bear. Stop looking at me, glass eye. I ripped off the tin lid. It smelled like popcorn. Small, stale kernels were wedged in around the edges. There was a fold-up piece of material. It was the key to my escape. I unfolded the material carefully, like a curated item from a time capsule. And just like my vision, there was that shit brown weed, barely more than seeds and stems. There it was, right where I had stashed it, my dirt fucking weed. It was in that forest green tin wrapped in that original Venice Beach bagging. I needed it now. I needed to be with me in my backpack. I needed to travel with me. I needed to travel with me wherever I ended up. I could not leave without it. Essential item, essential survival, surviving this war with secret spies and reborn Nazis and people in masks, people who refuse to take off their masks. I grabbed it, buried it in my backpack, and laid my full body weight on top of my dog, Nature, my calming dog, immune to emotion. She accepted my love like the weather. It was there, nothing she could do about it, but wait until it passed. I scratched behind her ears and above her tail. It wagged out of obligation and reflex. She had sad Labrador eyes and seemed empathetic to my plight, but she was indifferent. She didn't know war. She didn't know combat. She was even nice to the hissing opossum. She stood in front of the nocturnal beast, licking her nose with her wet pink tongue until thwack, that asshole opossum sideswiped her snout with a fistful of daggers. Claws. Nature was my soulmate, my partner in sad and lonely. She could not wear a mask and she could not throw a grenade or a gas bomb or knife. She had no opposable thumbs, so she was an ally. I could wiggle my nose in front of her wet muzzle, and she sat patiently, collapsing on all fours to sleep like temporary death had struck her. She was so calm. Where I was going, she could not go. She would be eaten alive, and maybe I would be too. I had to go. I don't know why I was chosen to move out. I don't know why they wanted me to leave, but I knew it was absolutely essential to say goodbye to nature, to escape the tightening parental grip of my controlling father, to run from the cascade of sound. My dad did not understand that Michael Jackson had communicated with me directly, and that I knew of a direct tunnel to Neverland, not necessarily a safe place, but a place I could go if I needed. A last resort, Neverland. When I saw Michael Jackson wore mask upon mask and would remove each one, revealing different faces, like a Russian doll shedding compartmental tears of painted tiki. I grabbed the shitweed and filled my backpack with several small cameras and to document atrocities. It was a JanSport back-to-school backpack with a leather bottom, another Costco special. I packed a change of clothes and papers I had been working on, my manifestos about Nicaragua and the Holocaust and the Muppets, some drawings and diagrams. I did not leave the house quietly. Many doors slammed in my wake. I left my Magnavox on, waves of big guitars colliding, a tsunami of screeching sound. I was not communicating effectively with my dad. He did not understand anything. He yelled when I was suffocating in stereo, but now I wanted him to know I was gone, going forever, goodbye at age 16. My stepmom, Marilyn, was away at her stepdad's bar mitzvah in Chicago. He was too old to be bar mitzvahed, but I respected his newfound love of the Torah, of God, of ritual, of holiness. I believed so deeply in God that I did not think a book could hold the majesty. Not scrolls, not nothing. God had chosen me to be a savior and to be saved, which meant escape. And so I did. I ran out the side door screaming, my dad chasing me. I think he yelled. I yelled back. I was that song. I was screaming those guitars. I was signaling something. He grabbed my backpack, and we struggled in the driveway near Marilyn's mustard yellow Volvo station wagon. I was a prisoner held back, held against my will, trapped in a house masked with shingles. Rights revoked, violated. Eventually, I let go. The backpack didn't matter. Escape did. He opened the small pouch and saw a handful of keychains with cameras. No big deal. Except for the keychain that contained the key to my Honda Civic hatchback. He took that key. He opened the big compartment and rifled through until he saw the folded material. He unfolded it and took my shit dirt wheat. I screamed about unfairness and abuse. I needed my car, but I needed that shit dirt weed more. It was like an oracle. Magic leaves so potent, I didn't even want to smoke them. I screamed, that is mine. I am a person with rights. And he grabbed my arm. You can't go anywhere. And I was gone, hysterical and running down Beechwood Drive with a backpack full of shit, but not my shit weed. My dad followed about 3/4 of a block behind me, keeping up and keeping his distance. I was not so much crying as bellowing and heaving and crashing into the cement. I turned right on Rosewood and left onto Larchmont. I knew there was a payphone on Larchmont and Beverly. I could call someone. I could get away. I could be free. I could go to Neverland. I could remove Michael Jackson's mask and find skin, humanity, a preserved and sweet boy aching for identity and autonomy. That didn't age well. I could free him. I could see his real face, his real smooth skin. The thing was, my dad wasn't the only person after me. The Nazis were after me. There was a violent war in Central America that had just ended, but I knew from Sandinista training with Salvadoran guerrillas that the war was far from over, and I needed to be free to fight. I was on call to save the world, from the Nazis, the Contras, to free Michael Jackson. Oh, wait, you thought Michael Jackson was free already? Ha! They got you to believe that. And to free myself from my chasing me dad, who was clearly throwing a wrench in my self-determination. I had an idea. It was a good one. If I stopped at a payphone, my dad would try to get me home. But he could not make a scene. It was not in his nature. He was first generation German, and Larchmont Boulevard would echo angry voices. I saw activity at Prado, a restaurant we'd been to for dinner as a family. I'd eaten soft shell crabs to celebrate graduation or an anniversary or straight A's. Javier Prado, the owner, had opened the place 2 years before in 1991, a fancy addition to our neighborhood. Javier was previously the head of the Ivy. I looked in the window and saw ladders and drop cloths and a handful of people painting the ceiling a deep, dusky turquoise. They were expanding the dining room and technically closed. I opened the door and went in anyway, hot mess radiating in every direction. Javier sat me down past the drop cloths and the ladders by the kitchen, away from the ceiling painting. He gave me a glass of water. His wife listened to me. I told them my father had kidnapped me and abused me, that he was after me, that I had to run away. Then my dad showed up, a late 40s bespectacled lawyer with sparse Jewish hair. He was out of breath and demanding to see me, frantic in his own calm presentation. They kept me sheltered away from him, my supposed abuser, though they did not know what to do with me. No explanation from my dad was sufficient. They didn't know I was an unreliable narrator. I did not know that either. So I sat with my water, and eventually I called my mom from their phone at the hostess area. She was expecting this call. My stepdad, Jeff, and my mom had just gotten back from Maine. I flew home early to get ready for the school year. I was particularly taken with the loons, calling out to them as they shouted to each other, diving through the cold lake, inspired by their long runs underwater. Did you know the loon plumage went gray in winter? Did you know loons have a salt gland near their eyes and can live in fresh water and salt water? Did you know they need a quarter-mile runway to take off and leave the lake when they migrate? I sat in Prado's kitchen, clutching my JanSport backpack, comforted by the dishes being washed and by a new friend. Javier's daughter was 3 years younger than I and had Down syndrome. The lilt of her voice made me think we were talking in code, that she understood me and I understood her, and that as long as things were being washed, we were both okay. I could read her thoughts. They were about math and school. I touched her hand, and I felt, just by sitting in close proximity, that I understood her deeper than she had ever been understood before, and that I could help her, and that she could help me. I felt bonded by trauma. I no longer had this urgency to battle and run from Nazis. I just wanted to talk to this girl who did not make it a practice to talk to many people. I was special. She was special. Things were being washed. I was calmer than I had been in 3 months. We were telepathically in a deep embrace, a mind-soul hug that went on for minutes, maybe decades, maybe never at all. All summer, I'd been operating on a more efficient schedule, no sleep and little food. The past 5 days, I'd ramped up my regimen. I hadn't slept, not for a minute. For the 5 nights previous to this one, I hadn't eaten much because most of what I was being fed was poison, obviously. I hadn't eaten much because I was running on vapors. Occasionally, the late Jim Henson would come to me in a vision, warm, bearded, kind Jim Henson, an oracle for all things sensational, inspirational, celebrational, muppetational. But here, under a half-painted ceiling, I was still. My mom pulled up to Prado with Jeff in the passenger seat. My dad was still hovering outside the restaurant, not allowed in, on my orders, shunned as an abuser. They regrouped, strategized. They had already formulated a plan. My mom had consulted with her therapist about what one does with a daughter full of demons. My dad went home to get his car and got his car. It was after dark, and in my mom's silver sedan, clutching my backpack full of end-of-world supplies, she pulled away from Prado, steering toward Westwood, with my dad following. I thought that if I needed to, I could tutor Javier's daughter to go to school. I could make enough money to afford to pay for Yale. Maybe Javier would even spot me tuition for a year because obviously I was now estranged from my father. I had a plan to pay for Yale, a school I was determined and destined to go to. Javier could be one of my 4 corporate sponsors. He could be first step, sponsor a year of school, and then I would work for him for a year, wash dishes, tutor, whatever. Then I would have a second-year corporate sponsor like my Uncle Steve. He worked at Suicidal. And so on and so forth, an expensive education paid for. I had a plan, it would work, it was working. I was safe from my dad, a lane of traffic away. I had my backpack and my paperwork. Neverland could wait. For now, Yale would be next year this time exactly. We arrived at the UCLA emergency room after dark, pulling into the curved brick driveway behind ambulances and EMTs. We didn't normally go to UCLA for emergencies. I was confused. Why were we going to the hospital at all? My mom said something to the effect of, "We don't know what the fuck is going on. We don't know what to do. We are out of options, and we are fucking scared." There are doctors past those motion-censored glass doors that know what to do. They're gonna help you because we can't anymore. My mom, though a tiny human, was fierce and forceful. She happily employed the vocabulary of her Teamster father. I got out of the car cautiously. My mom said in a tired, terse, exasperated, desperate, "Please listen to me, demon daughter way. This hospital has a neuropsychiatric institute for adolescents." I did not register the implication of the statement. I just saw a waiting room full of masked faces and permanent grimace. This was the place I was supposed to be, the place to engage in the war that haunted me. I had to crawl through the belly of a dark beast to see the shining, graceful light of shelter, and so I agreed. In the waiting room, I was pacing and agitated, and I had a death grip on my backpack. There were people suffering from traumatic car accidents, broken limbs, bleeding out from fresh flesh wounds, and feverish babies wailing into the night. I was not bothered by their pain. I went up to each of them to ask the specifics of their condition, to understand why they were there and what their relationship to me could possibly be. Everyone was related to me and my cause. My mom saw this and intervened. She told me to stop talking to strangers, to stop talking so closely to other invalids. She purposely put limits on me and confined me. If she provoked me, I might have an outburst and get treated faster. If she told me no, I would wildly insist on yes. I wasn't just another shingles outbreak or sprained elbow. I was speaking in tongues and trying to heal those broken patients or enlist them in my army. I was channeling the Muppets and Michael Jackson to let them know that everything would be all right. I was murmuring to myself about poison and electrified by the possibility of an elaborate escape plan. The waiting room responded with despondent heaves and sighs and groans of pain. People were suffering, and I insisted on Uzis and rainbows. Reception noticed. I was escorted by antiseptic nurses and unfeeling night administrators past the doors and away from my parents to a gurney where I lay down willingly for strangers. I was nightgown swaddled and buckled in. I didn't fight. The night shift psychiatrist was young and handsome, and I remember feeling like a queen being rolled around the ER. Again, like at Prado, I felt instantly okay. War was on the outside. I was here to expand my psychological presence to return to the battlefield better equipped. I was smitten with this handsome ER doctor who was going to make me better, who was doing my bidding and not the other way around. The restraints were just proof of my importance, of my power. He asked me questions to determine my level of sanity, questions of logic and determination, questions that were like a test. There's no logic in this world, I thought. How can you test that? How can you know that? But I knew how to game the system. I knew the right answers inherently. He did a physical exam, a neurological exam, lab work, a mental status examination, and a medical history. I refused the breast, rectal, and general exam. I was rolled onto an elevator and kept in seclusion for a night. The intake report said what was already obvious to everyone around me. I was exhibiting an increased psychomotor rate, decreased need for sleep, and about 2 or 3 hours a night, racing thoughts and paranoid ideation regarding her parents following her and watching her, as well as taping the phone calls she was making. I woke groggy from sedation. The ER docs ruled out head trauma, other medical conditions, and use of drugs or intoxication. They determined that I was in need of psychiatric care and asked me about my mood, voices, my beliefs, if I was suicidal. They tested me with questions to determine how abstract my thoughts were and whether my mind was being controlled by other people. I thought, I'm going in deep, deep cover. I will find the evil in these neutral walls. I will exterminate before I'm exterminated. There's no guarantee of survival, but I must push on into this heart of darkness, penetrate the system, broadcast the corruption, and be hailed a singular hero with omniscient knowledge of the universe, past, present, future. I believed I had special powers, the report noted. I knew when the end of the world was coming due to toxic substances and felt that I was the only one who could stop it. I tried to tell everyone in the waiting room, but they were too busy crying over broken bones. This was the end of the world. This was not a drill. One persistent thought, a gut instinct, was that I was the one, the only one, a prophesized being, special, sent to Earth with a mysterious mission. One that I was just now understanding with each passing day. I was Jesus, I was Bob Dylan, I was Hitler, I was John Wilkes Booth, Derrida, Marx, the Monkey Wrench Gang, a bear, a pile of glitter, and a galaxy. I was in an action movie, a war movie, a rom-com. I was the protagonist in all of these, of course. I had to warn the population at large about the future nuclear annihilation, war, genocide, apocalypse on the highest scale, bigger than biblical. I would fall in love along the way. I would recruit this love to fight the larger epic war. The feeling was that of incredible pressure and responsibility. I could not believe I was tasked with this. I was only 16. I was an average teen. But this is how superheroes are born. Pull back and picture this same person, this superhero 20 years later. She's stretched out making angels in an endless desert, her wings imprinted on the Bolivian salt flats, the infinite forever land of Lithium. She is spellbound. She leaves an impression of her body in the cool, wet, iridescent, crystallized, cacti-marked terrain. She wonders if eating the salt crust will help or hurt. She's equipped with armor and weaponry and powers bestowed on her by chance. She has conquered demons, won the apocalypse, and now, stretched to the brink, she soaks and steeps in the element of her making. She knows it doesn't matter. This place, this pilgrimage is bigger than she is, bigger than anything she's known. She thinks back to the beginning when it was just a capsule and a cure. And she thinks to the future when it is corrupting her insides. This is what she's made of. This is who she is. This is how she came to be. She's there to be intimate with her keeper and her kryptonite, to marinate in it and rub it between her fingers, up to her forearms, into her pores. She walks barefoot. The lithium rises up through the soles of her feet, floods her body, and touches her brain. Really good holiday present. Super uplifting.
Wow. I'll say that for everybody, right? Wow. First of all, welcome, Dr. Mark D'Antonio and Jamie. I'm really happy to be up here with both of you. And I'm just going to jump right in because one of the things that you talked about in an interview, Jamie, is how important it was to you to immerse readers in what it is to have a manic episode. And anyone who hasn't had one, that was quite an immersion. And I want to give you kudos for that. You had, you write about that you had your first episode at 16 and you had your second episode at 25. And you also said in an interview that I changed. The episode itself was traumatic. I want you to talk a little bit about, now that you've just given us this experience of what it's like, how it is life-changing, how having an episode, how, even before you know what the language is, what it is to be diagnosed, just what it is to be immersed in that actual experience.
Sure. So, on. There we go.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that's a two-part question, really. And one is the trauma that comes after the episodes, which is very serious and very difficult to deal with, because I think that when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about PTSD or these events that just change the course of your personal narrative. So you start out sort of existing on one level, and then something very serious happens, and you end up in a completely different place and really change into a different person. One of the things about having a manic episode is that I think that some people think of it as something that happens in a vacuum and something that is sometimes not remembered, but it's actually completely experienced. Every second of it is something that I'm me. I am existing in every moment, that I am destroying relationships, that I am, accusing my dad of being abusive, or that my mom is yelling at me and, cursing a lot, which happens when I'm manic or not manic sometimes.
I think that's one of the things that is interesting to the reader from the first page, is the fact that you're writing this much later in life. And the fact that it is so, I think the idea that people have is that when you're in a depressive episode or you're in a manic episode, that you are somehow not yourself and that you are not remembering it. So I think that's something that you're really bringing to the forefront in this book.
I hope, thank you. And then the second part of it, which is like what happens when you get a diagnosis, is almost the opposite, because we're talking about at least an explanation and hope and some method of moving forward, because you have more of a plan, you have a community, you have other people who have experienced this before you, and it is a relief in some ways. I know it was probably for my family and my support system.
Right, but I want to ask you one more question, and then I want to ask Mark a question. But another thing is, when you're writing it, you're going through. As writers, all of us, what we're doing is we're processing our life. So that is very different than especially when we suffer from mental illness. We sometimes just on a daily basis, we're just a function, just to survive. Is very different than a person that doesn't have to actually wake up and go, I want to make it to the end of the day. So how was it to actually process it? Did it change the experience for you? Did it make you look at it in a different way, have a different perspective?
To look at
the actual episodes and the way that they altered your life.
When I was writing it, or
yes,
when they were
as
happening?
You were writing it. What was the emotional response as you were writing it?
The emotional response was, why am I doing this to myself and immersing myself in this once again, which was some form of, it was difficult to actually think about it very intensely again. And I re-examined it in a way that was both dealing with memories and artifacts, and then also re-interviewing a lot of people who were there. And so a lot of stuff came up that I just didn't remember, or that wasn't even something I knew. I think that dealing with it on the day-to-day while I was writing was really hard, because I think that I try to function without thinking about it, without thinking about my mental health. There are definitely days where I'm forced to, but I think while writing it, it was hard.
Right. And you're talking about the fact that, and I think many of us have experienced it, or we've witnessed it with people in our lives, is it's life-changing to be diagnosed. To all of a sudden have the language for what you're experiencing, and to not blame yourself for your behaviors because all of a sudden you can understand it. But I want to ask you, Dr. D'Antonio, Mark, you are, you're giving a gift to the patient, to the parents, by giving this diagnosis. But one of the things that, I think is always a question, especially with your specialty in adolescence, is how do we see these things? How do parents, how do teachers, how do friends know early enough the signs of what is just crazy adolescence, and what are the actual symptoms? How does it start to present itself, and how do you make these diagnoses, especially with with Jamie, it's bipolar 1. So a manic episode sometimes might be very, very obvious. But sometimes if it's bipolar 2 and it's a depressive episode, that might not be as noticeable. How can you help parents and people in someone's life to, see these signals, because you're not always there?
Well, in Jamie's case, it was pretty clear.
Do you have a microphone?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think.
In Jamie's case, when I saw her after she came from the ER, it was pretty clear what was going on. And I couldn't imagine any other diagnosis was happening. It wasn't a mild thing or adolescent drama. She had a major psychiatric illness that needed intensive treatment. But it is true that there is a lot of adolescent psychiatry issues that are often very hard to tease out. That the onset of hormones and growth, the overwhelmment of the challenges of adolescence, of mastering autonomy and competency, creates a lot of drama. And it is really hard to sort out what's drama and what's a true illness, and you can, in milder forms of mood disorders, it gets tricky. Well, they're bipolar 2 because they stayed up all night on their phone. Well, I don't think so. There's you really have to have a good understanding of adolescents and what they do and who they are and what's normative and what really feels not so. And then also, when you throw in things like substance abuse or substance use in adolescence, it really complicates things, and things can look like a serious mental illness that really has to do with they need to stop using certain substances, and maybe it will go away, or it really is the substances talking. And it often is much more ambiguous and subtle in figuring things out in adolescence in terms of the boundary between real mental illness happening and just an adolescent struggling, having a bad time being a teenager, and bad things happen. But sometimes it's crystal clear. This was one of the times it was crystal clear.
You were a classic case.
Yeah, she was a
Score
classic.
one for
Yeah,
me.
I mean, if you were going to do it, just go for it.
Always go all the way, Big.
Just how she presented the timeline and everything. I had no question about what was going on. The challenge is she was incredibly manic and incredibly ill. It took weeks for her to get better. And it was a very challenging experience and very traumatic for her and her parents. It was very difficult.
And, you talk about it being traumatic, and that's one of the things that Ellen Sachs talks about, and she's talked about it in her TED Talk, about the hospitalization. And I know this from my own experience. I mean, that's one of the things that you dread, and the older you get, it's almost like you dread it more and more. And you talk about in your book when you had episodes as you got older, or you feared episodes as you're older, the last thing you wanted to do is be hospitalized. The trauma itself of being hospitalized. I want to talk a little bit about that and how we as a society and as providers of health mental health providers and also as autonomous beings. What are our rights? One of the things that you kept experiencing is you kept saying, I have my rights, I have my rights. And the nurses kept saying to you, no, you don't. And Ellen Sachs talks about the fact that when she was writing her paper for Yale Law School, she talked about the use of restraints and how that it was demeaning and frightening. And the professor that she was working with told her, well, people don't feel it, mentally ill people don't feel it the same way we do, not realizing that she was talking about herself.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that experience because you had a unique experience. And then I also want to hear it from your side of it. This idea of where is that balance of the trauma of being hospitalized and having to be restrained in some way and being forced to take treatments that at the time you were refusing and it being needed and it solving the problem sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, where is that balance, and has your attitude changed about that?
Well, I think that I had no idea what was needed. I was, as Dr. D'Antonio said, I was manic beyond recognition. There was no way that I was going to decide what was needed because I thought apocalypse was near and I was preparing for that. I was very busy. And so I think that hospitalization was obviously necessary then. And in terms of my rights, I was 16. I had none. You're under 18, you have no rights. And so at that point in my life, that's just the reality. That's our legal system. When I was 25, one of the reasons that, Dr. D'Antonio, again, he was treating me and he basically said, everything that needs to happen to not have you institutionalized is what we're going to do. And was essentially, my dad reminded me on call like 24/7 to make sure that I wasn't institutionalized. And that's the dedication of somebody who knew what I went through and then was there again to make sure that I was going to be okay. I think being in the hospital when I was hospitalized, it was obviously a really difficult experience. I can tell you that from today. I woke up in a full body sweat just from being across the street and was the only thing I can think of is that it's just really hard to see the building. It's really hard to be reminded of the time. It's a really, even though it was really the beginning of my life because I could actually function and move on and live, it was a real struggle to get there. Do you have a comment?
Well, there is, treating people in a locked psychiatric unit has an element of trauma. It's not what the staff, physicians, nurses, and other staff want, but it's just an extremely challenging issue because people are in such an altered state they can't process what's going on. I'm just remembering one issue with Jamie was in the day room and just totally, I think it was a day where we thought she was doing much better. Then all of a sudden she got in her head about this thing about the Sandinistas or something in Central America that she had to fix, and she was going to leave right now. She was kind of threatening to throw chairs, and she had her backpack on, and she was escorted to the seclusion room. And she was in a very volatile, agitated state. And the issue is we needed to separate this backpack from her because it wasn't safe for her to be in the seclusion room with a backpack on.
Very attached to the backpack.
And she was very attached.
And it didn't even have the shit weed in it anymore.
Right. It didn't probably have anything in it.
No, there were things. I'm sure there were things in it, and and it was it was very intrusive. And, how are we going to do it? And, we had big, strong people that we could do it one way, we could do it another. And I kind of said, let me give it a try. And I talked to her, and I somehow convinced her that the revolution will go on if you separate the backpack for a little while you can calm down in the seclusion room, because that she didn't realize otherwise the next step is that you were going to be put prone on the ground by 5 people, and it's going to be removed from you, and it will be traumatic. And
I was put on the ground at one point.
You were.
Maybe a different occasion.
On a different occasion.
And that was traumatic. It's true.
It was traumatic, but she was in the hospital for a number of weeks, like 9.
No, less.
Mm-hmm.
It was less.
I don't know. It was a lot. And she was
like
unremittingly psychotic and agitated. And it's very, very intrusive and traumatic to manage that, and finally to get her under control, so that she could walk out back to the state that she was in before the manic episode started. And it was traumatic for her parents to see her in this state. And it was traumatic for other people to try to contain her. It was really tough.
And I think that it's something for us all to keep in mind, that there's adults in this situation also. I mean, in this instance, we're talking about Jamie's book, but there's adults, and many of them are also ending up in our jails because they don't get the help that they need, and so they're restrained in that way. But I think that the idea of lack of autonomy is something that is very traumatic for adults, and it's something that we need to think about, and it needs to be addressed, because one of the things that I think happens is Jamie was lucky. She had a really strong support network where Dr. D'Antonio was able to speak to her parents, and her parents were able to be making informed decisions about her care. That's not always the case. And for an adult, I think that maybe one of the recommendations is, if you have a mental illness, that you assign somebody in your life. If you are not capable of, if there's moments when you are not capable of making a decision, possibly that there's somebody else in your life that could help make those decisions, because it's a very scary place to be.
Well, her second episode, when she was 25, I mean, she seemed just about as manic as the first one. And I said, you need to go in the hospital. And she just felt, I don't want to do that. Don't do that to me. It was so traumatic to be in the hospital. I said, okay, we can try to do this outside the hospital. And I mean, it was really hard. I think it was really hard to do. It took a lot of intensive work in meeting, and I think, and fortunately, Jamie was able to somewhat listen to her parents, and create a hospital setting at home that allowed her to get through this manic episode without being hospitalized. Although I was really concerned on a regular basis that it was not going to work. But it did work, and I was trying to...
I always think of this as my fun manic episode, the 25-year one.
And I was really trying to be sensitive to her not wanting to be re-traumatized by being in the hospital, because being in the hospital, there are other patients there. There's a black and white quality things. You start screaming at 11 at night and pushing chairs, and they're just not going to allow that to happen. It's just the way it is. There are other people, there are safety issues. People are going to put hands on and contain you. Okay? And Jaime was very difficult, very challenging, and there were people who were incredibly patient who helped her go through this. But there was a part of her that kept herself in a degree of control that allowed her to go through something that lasted for a number of weeks again, not days, but weeks, before she was able to cycle out of this episode and kind of return to herself. And to keep her from being traumatized by being hospitalized.
Kudos.
Thanks.
I'm going to move on to go, because there's just so much in your book, and I want to move past the book a little bit. But I think that one of the things that probably will be fascinating for readers and for anybody that has suffered from mental illness or been treated by a psychologist or had therapy is the fact that you, as an adult, were able to go back as a quote unquote journalist and research your own materials. The fact that you were able to go back and read the notes on your own hospitalization, on your own therapy.
Mm-hmm.
There can't be anybody that's ever been in therapy that doesn't want to read the notes, right?
Everybody can. Everybody can.
I know. It's your legal right to do so, and I'm going to be doing that next week. But I think it's fascinating because you are having an experience. And as you said, you have your own, we create narratives, whether you're mentally ill or not. We all create this narrative, what our life is and how we're experiencing it. And it's very fascinating to read your interpretation of the notes of your behavior. And I just want to pick up on one thing that I thought was really interesting, especially when you talk about Carrie Fisher towards the end of the novel, who I, like you, I cried, John will attest to this, I cried hysterically like the woman was my best friend when she died, because I so personalized her experience. And the fact that she died at such an early age, I felt it was completely related to being bipolar and all of the behaviors that are related to it. But the idea that as a woman, you present as being aggressive, and that is so often what is in your notes, and what is in your hospitalization, or if you go into any kind of treatment centers. As a woman with mental illness, it's almost always in your notes that you are aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think about that?
I think that I wasn't surprised, and it's not inaccurate, but also it's a relative term, because I think it's true that men are not always described that way, and that word isn't used, and I think it's sometimes pejorative towards women. I also, when I was just rereading some of the intake note report, and one of the symptoms that was noted was that I was being bossy towards my parents, which was hysterical because that could be any day at any time up until today. Like, it was, I think sometimes it's very imperceptible, some of the symptoms. And I do think that, I feel like aggression is relative, and it's like, therapy is also a very weird space to judge whether or not a person is being aggressive and how and what it means. It's like it's a different contained bubble.
Well, it also, part of what you struggle with mental illness is the idea of identity, and how much is a symptom and how much is your actual personality. So if you're struggling with that and then they're placing labels, it's hard to separate.
Right. I think it's always hard to separate. Yeah. I think that there's no way to actually look in the mirror and say, oh, this is clearly, who I am, and this is clearly what being bipolar is. I think they're tangled up, they're braided. It's what I've experienced. And when we talk about how an episode is traumatic, well, that and how it shifts your personal narrative, that affects who you are for the rest of your life. That when you're traveling here and then you go up like this, then you're up here. But all of this space is from having experienced that. Yeah. And it's impossible to separate. And I'm not sure I would want to. I can't, because you wouldn't separate experiences, in your life.
Well, and I think one of the things that you have to accept as you move forward, and I watch you, your journey throughout the book. I keep wanting to call it a novel because it reads like one, but it's your life. But I guess all our lives are a novel. Is this idea that sometimes you feel like you want to recapture the past, like the things that you lost or the relationships that you possibly destroyed. You have this desire after an episode or after a period of time that you have to somehow recapture the past. But maybe the whole thing is, and you talk about the idea of that our the human mind needs to move forward. That in order to get past trauma, really the natural reaction is to move forward. How has that helped you heal to accept that?
I think it's just really, it's so hard because I think in the immediate after effect of an episode, you know, one of the things about mania is that you're just incredibly free. You're talking to everyone.
You're so cool.
Like, right. You're doing so many things that are so amazing, and everything's amazing, and the world's amazing. And at the same time, you're incredibly destructive. You're burning bridges and literally burning my house, like not on purpose. But like so much bad is happening while you're walking around laying down roads of glitter and fairy dust. And so part of the aftermath is looking back on that person, and you do feel handcuffed by medication. You do feel handcuffed by getting better, and you do feel handcuffed by this idea that you have to be, you know, sane, and that you don't have the freedom anymore to live in this space that you absolutely cannot sustain. And it is not what you should do. But it's hard not to look back on it with rose tinted glasses and to be a little bit in love with that person who is absolutely not you either. But you experienced it and you felt it.
Mm-hmm. And that leads me to one of the things that Mark, you and I were talking about on the phone, is this idea that, you know, as Jamie's saying, if you've reached a point where you are being medicated, and Jamie was on lithium for a very long time, so she has bipolar disorder, and yet she's very well controlled on lithium. How do you, as her doctor, make the kind of decisions of whether or not she should stay on the medication? How long do you stay on it? Like, what kind of considerations are you making in that?
It's a difficult. It's actually becomes a difficult decision. I mean, there's kind of rules of 5 years that happen in medicine for a lot of different illnesses and diseases. You know, if you're cancer free for 5 years, you're cured. It's unfortunately not always true. And you know, I think the challenge for some people with bipolar disorder is that they're on a mood stabilizing medication, and they feel totally normal, and it goes on for years. And why should they continue to take this medication? You know, there are other people who have little mini episodes, you know, 2 years later, and it kind of reinforces, yep, you need to stay on this. You know, they are clearly a little manic for 5 days, and then it goes away. And actually being on the medication helps control that episode to make it just a mild episode for 5 days. But then it reminds you, yep, that's why you're on the medication. But other people like Jamie didn't have that on the medication. She had no symptoms of mania at all. And
not just not to interrupt you, but that wasn't totally clear in the book. You were completely symptom free for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. No, lithium really worked.
Right.
Lithium
and then the question is, well, how long do you do this? And you know, the problem is there really aren't 30-year studies that you can kind of say, yep, you got to do that. You know, there aren't studies that long. There certainly are knowing there are people who have manic episodes and have no episodes, and 30 years later have another episode. So you can have even a very severe manic episode and have it and not be on medication and have it reoccur in your have the first one in your 20s and have another one in your 50s. That can happen, and in between have no episode. And so it becomes, and so there isn't always a crystal clear answer about what to do and what not to do. And Jamie's episode at 25 was her wish to be off lithium, and it was not done in an impulsive way, but it was done in consultation with her ongoing psychiatrist in New York, as well as me, and she wanted to try it and did not work out.
Yeah, it didn't seem to go well.
No.
It did not go well. Within months, a couple months, she was back in a totally manic state. So then that makes you kind of think just common sense is, well, you need to just stay on this medication forever because Jamie's manic episodes are not mild. The 2 episodes she had were very intense and very disruptive, unsafe, and damaging to her life, and really traumatic. And I, so unfortunately, I wish there was better science to this or predictability to it. But so there's a trial and error. So we did a trial, and it was a mistake. On the other hand, I think it was very hard and understandable for someone in their mid-20s where they had an episode as a teenager. And why should they be saddled with a commitment to lifelong medication when they're symptom-free and functioning? And do I really need to be on this medication? And the medication has consequences. It can affect your thyroid, and it can actually ruin your kidneys. Okay, it's not completely benign. And so I think there's a natural inclination is, why should I keep taking this stuff? I'm fine. And she tried it, and she needs to keep taking it.
So one of the things that I love about your writing is that you are what I consider a journalist. You write a lot of really amazing pieces, and
Thank you.
you wrote a New York Times review piece, an opinion piece called "The Wrong Pill Can Play with Your Mind," back in 2017. And what I realized you did was you basically distilled a large section of chapter 23 from the book. And I thought it was a very hard-hitting piece about psychopharmacology, and I don't think we can ignore it. And I want to quote you. You basically said, "I took the pills blindly and trusted a dysfunctional system." That is something that I think many of us have dealt with. And I think that that's one of the big issues that we as a society are dealing with now, not just with insurance companies, but the fact that many of us are getting prescribed not by qualified psychiatrists, but by our local physician or by anybody that can write a prescription. And you talk about that just small shifts in disseminating information would make a big difference. Can you talk just a little bit about that and why you wrote this piece and why it's so important to you, this idea of how sometimes the wrong drug can really impact someone's life?
Right. I did that because, as Dr. D'Antonio mentioned, lithium has severe side effects. One of them is that my kidneys are dysfunctional. And so about 3 years ago, I was faced with a choice of I'll stay on lithium and know that I have to get a kidney transplant, or I have to make a very serious choice of starting a new medication, which is again it's a bad choice, because if you start a new medication, the only way to know that it's not working is if you have an episode. So there's this really, really scary risk involved. And it was done again with Dr. Schwartz, who's my ongoing psychiatrist in New York. And we tried several different medications. And the first one we tried was Depakote. This is one of the problems, is that there's Depakote DR and Depakote DE, or ER. Yeah, it's extended release and delayed release, DR and ER. And the difference for me was something that basically incapacitated me and was not something that I could actually function on. And I was just crying all the time and like couldn't move, and it was terrible. And then the other medication really, really worked. And it was actually just the simple like difference between DR and ER. And I had first been prescribed the DR. I actually, by accident, the pharmacy gave me the wrong medication, and it didn't work. And so essentially, that like there's a lot of different layers of problems in terms of dealing with medication, and many medications don't work. I mean, that's the other problem. So the other medication that I tried had a severe effect on my thyroid, which was caught kind of by accident by my general practitioner. And that was a whole other thing. And so then we went back and tried the Depakote, and it ended up being the ER, and that's actually worked. And I've had that for 3 years and no episodes.
Well, and I think that one of the things that your article and your book, I'm not going to read it, but there's like basically 3 full pages towards the end of the book where you talk about psychopharmacology and science behind it, and how the insurance companies are impacting it and doctors are impacting it. And I think if anybody just read 3 pages, they should read those 3 pages, because the burden is really falling on us as patients and as the family members of patients. The burden is falling on us to educate ourselves, to really take that on, because we can't just rely on our pharmacy. We can't rely anymore on the doctors that are prescribing of having the knowledge. And it's unfortunate. But I think that it's really important that we take our own health and our own medication in our own hands. And if we can't, then we need to ask somebody to help us with it, because your experience was a scary experience, and there's many people that have had it. I personally was hospitalized one time, and the doctors decided that they weren't going to give me Effexor because it was too expensive, and they gave me venlafaxine, which was the generic. And I had a horrible reaction. It was horrible. It didn't work. And they didn't, that was not me having the autonomy or the knowledge to make a decision that was not correct. So I had to educate myself. And I think that's important. There's one other thing that I want to get to, and then we're going to get to questions. But one of the things that my company is known for is you read a book, but then there's experiences. And I think that not just the reader goes beyond the book, but I think sometimes the writer, you yourself, has an experience that you write a book and then you go beyond it. Something happens past the writing of the book. And on page 21 of your book, you very barely touch something. You say, is mental illness a result of nature or nurture? How many of these diseases are caused by experienced trauma? How many by a genetic lottery? How many by a combination of both? Simple question. And in the book, you breeze over very lightly a trauma that happens to you. But recently, just in August, you did This American Life with Ira Glass. And anybody who gets an opportunity to listen to it, it's titled 10 Sessions, as Deborah noted. And you went through a 2-week, 10-day process of cognitive processing therapy for your trauma. And I'd love you to just talk about how that was life-changing for you, and how it changed your experience. Because you said something that I thought was really important, and it's something that I think a lot of people with mental illness use the word shame. And you said at the end of those 10 episodes, you said that you had always avoided the word shame, but then you used it. And I really want you to talk about that tonight.
Sure. So I think that one of the things that actually also fits in with having an episode and being hospitalized and having to deal with the aftermath of that is extreme shame and extreme sort of embarrassment, and having to kind of re-put together your life and the pieces and relationships. And some relationships never get put back together. And some relationships are forever altered. What happened when I did the 10 sessions in CPT, which is very different than a weekly therapy. I was addressing a sexual assault that happened when I was 13. And it was really going back, and in a lot of ways, it was looking at what happened from many, many different angles. It was trying to understand what I was telling myself and what were other ways of looking at it that I wasn't actually acknowledging. And so there was a lot of, things that I was holding on to in terms of what happened that weren't entirely true, that there was more to it, that there were more ways of seeing it, that there were other sort of possibilities of describing the narrative of what I was thinking. And a lot of that has to do with shame. A lot of it has to do with, blame. And so the process of it is basically rewriting a narrative. And it's really wonky to describe. It's a lot easier to listen to. It's only an hour. Whee!
It's worth listening to. And I think that it also was fascinating from the point of another thing that's important is the idea of recovery. The idea that what people define as you are now recovered, or you are normal, or you are on drugs, and you are everyone. One of my really, really close friends always refers to my bipolar disorder as an invisible disease. She always says that, oh, you look fine. You're out, you're about, you're at dinner, whatever, you look fine. And I think that it's one of the things that is hard for people to understand, that you live with a constant fear of relapse. Mm-hmm. And you also don't know how to define normalcy. And I think that one of the things that's really beautiful about your book is you really let a reader who has experienced mental illness step inside it along with you, and you let someone who hasn't understand it and have empathy. And that's a really beautiful thing that you accomplished.
Thank you.
If you want, I'd love for you to just end before we take questions. You end your book by beautifully talking about being lucky. And I don't think a lot of people who talk about mental illness would say they were lucky.
Yeah, I guess not. Okay, I'm going to try and do this without crying. But here's the thing. I am among the 1% of the mentally ill. I am the luckiest mentally ill person. I'm the mentally illest. I was lucky. I have a family that supports me and understands me. Most don't. I was lucky. I was born into a family with enough money that I knew I would be financially supported if absolutely necessary, and I would have health coverage no matter what. Most people can't afford a Band-Aid and a neck brace. I was lucky. I was diagnosed young and had the chance to get treatment. Most mental illness can fester undiagnosed for decades. I was lucky. I grew up in an age of mental illness role models. Previous generations didn't talk about emotion or medication. I was lucky. Lithium worked for me almost immediately. Some patients have to take half a dozen drugs and still don't feel okay. I was lucky. When my life burned down, my industry, family, and friends forgave me and helped me rebuild. I was lucky. I had several psychiatrists walk me through this shit. Most people don't even get a social worker. I was lucky. My kidney is degenerating, but Dr. Lane and Dr. Schwartz caught it in time, and Dr. DeVita is nursing it along. Some people lose their kidney dysfunction altogether. I was lucky. Switching meds was hard, but I got the right kind of Depakote. Some people might have stopped at DR, or one of the 16 different versions of Depakote that affect people in entirely different ways. I was lucky. I get to experience all of life. One I would never trade for normal, whatever that is. I am lucky. Not everyone is.
I want to just end before we open to audience questions, and I want to thank Jamie so much for her book and for talking tonight. I also want to thank Deborah for inviting me, and all of the individuals at the Friends of the Semel Institute that asked me to be a part of this evening. Despite being on sabbatical for the better part of this year and not being on the stage since June due to my own bipolar disorder, I sent an open letter recently in which I finally shed the final shreds of shame and the fear of stigma to be honest about the impact my disease has had on my life and work. That letter was seen and passed on, and fortuitously brought me the honor of moderating tonight's open mind event. I often wonder if I had been diagnosed early in my life as Jamie was, if I would have had the courage to live as openly and honestly as she has. That is why deep conversations like we have had tonight, inspired by works like Mental by Jamie, are so important and must continue. Each of us on the stage tonight has our own role to play in helping to destigmatize mental illness, to inspire people to seek help for themselves and others, and to continue to support research and education in the fields of mental health and psychopharmacology. Jamie's powerful words are what brought us here and started this conversation. I would like to end with another inspirational writer's words. Ellen Sachs is the author of The Center Cannot Hold and a respected advocate for ethics in mental health and the law. She ended her TED Talk with the following: "The humanity we all share is more important than the mental illness we may not. What those of us that suffer with mental illness want is what everybody wants. In the words of Sigmund Freud, to work and to love." Thank you all.
So we now are going to invite questions from the audience. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone to you.
I had a question about the lithium, since that's a big part of this talk, and you guys probably know more about it than I do. But my understanding is that the problems from lithium are usually dose dependent, and there's another form that I've heard of lithium orotate that has a higher, it crosses the blood-brain barrier higher, more readily, and it may have better efficacy at lower doses. And I'm just wondering if anybody of you know if how that compares to the prescribed, more commonly prescribed forms of lithium.
I would say you probably are best. No.
Well, you were on a high dose, right?
I was on 900 milligrams of lithium, and then it was reduced to 750. I have heard that. I think people have written me that. I don't know. Not a good amount of lithium. So in terms of prescribing from the beginning,
I'm not aware that, lithium turns into lithium in your blood, and I'm not aware that different forms reach the brain in a different concentration. I'm just not aware of it. that it's you get a certain serum lithium level, and for an individual that level controls manic episodes. And I think the conventional way of doing things is just looking at the level of lithium in the blood.
I can tell you one thing. Make sure you don't take an Advil or cold medicine while you're on lithium, because you'll end up in the hospital. They don't always tell you that.
That's true.
I was toxic.
Maybe I took too much Advil.
Questions. Is there a trigger that causes an episode to come on? Can you feel it coming on? And also, what's the difference between treatment in hospital versus outpatient?
Well, for me, I would say no to a trigger necessarily, or that I don't know what it was if there was one. I think at least for the first episode. The second episode, I was not on lithium. I was definitely starting to act not totally sane. And then the apartment that I lived in burned down, and that definitely didn't help. And definitely sent me into a pretty severe, very severe manic episode for several months. But one of the side effects of being manic is a refusal to take medication. So when I was manic, if somebody said, all you need to do is to get better is to take this medication, I would immediately reject it, hide the medication in my cheek, spit it out later, do everything I could to never take the medication, because I thought I was perfect. I was having a great time. I was painting the sky with, rainbows and unicorns, and it was fantastic. And I couldn't imagine why anyone would take medication to change that.
I think that's one of the hardest things about the disease, and I'm bipolar 2, which is different than it presents more with depressive episodes. And even when I've been taught the various relapse things, I even when I sense a relapse and I've been taught all the tools of how to stop it, I still can't stop it. And I think that's one of the things that's really hard, is because then you beat yourself up even more that you couldn't stop it. So it's a vicious cycle that I personally have experienced many times, of why I can't stop it.
Sorry.
Right. I mean, you can. I mean, the main issue of inpatient is because a person is so uncontainable. It's very in a acute manic episode, you need to have people around you, and you probably need to have people around you 24/7, and that's often not pragmatically able to be done because you're just unsafe. Your perceptions, your actions, your impulsivity is really unsafe. So it's not just they can give you the pills. The pills are the same pills, inpatient or outpatient. Actually, her second episode was completely done outpatient because there were people around her, and she had a part of her awareness was to follow certain directions and stuff, like not run out all night, not, have lots of candles being lit.
More candles ever in my life. And
she was,
Barn has those fake ones.
and even though she was very manic, she was able to contain certain dysregulated behaviors so it could be safely done. But certainly her first episode, I don't think anyone could contain her.
What about the opposite, depressive episodes when the person is suicidal?
That's correct. I mean, in that case, you're really, again, person is in a very vulnerable place, and you're keeping them from destroying themselves. And it's hard to do that in an outpatient setting unless you have, again, 24/7 supervision of multiple people, and it's not practical for people to do that. And so that's what a hospital is for. But actually, the treatments can be done inpatient or outpatient. It's just the containment issue.
I have another question about the lithium. Is it now recommended for people who are bipolar to have their kidney function tested regularly to see if there is some reaction?
Oh, I had mine tested. I mean, I had, it was part of my routine test. It was just something that you see the creatinine levels rise.
How long did it take before it was obvious there were problems?
I was on it for about 23 years.
I was on it for 3 years, and then I had to be taken off because the levels were toxic.
Hi. Oh, sorry. So my question, you mentioned that having your episodes kind of informed who you were as a person, and then you're getting treatment to stop these episodes from happening. And it seems as though there's a battle between, like, I guess I was trying to figure out how to frame this, but if you're trying to figure out how to accept yourself in all regards, when you have something that's quite destructive to yourself and to your relationships with others, but it's also a really big part of who you are, how do you connect those two things? How do you, like, you know what I mean? Like, how do you make it okay?
That's a really good question. I don't think that it's ever okay or not okay. It just, I mean, it's going to be a really Yoda-y answer, but it just is, you know, like you have these things happen. They weren't preventable. They weren't your fault. You experience them, and then you have to deal with what the experience and its aftermath is, and that changes who you are. But the thing is you're not going to seek out those experiences or try to make them happen or continue to let them happen necessarily, because you know, or you're reminded by people who were there with you and who don't want to experience it either, that you don't want to have that happen again. That each time, I mean, for me, I think about how if I had a manic episode now, I'm in a really different position than I was when I was 25. And I don't know what kind of life altering experience would happen, how I would function next, how it would change me. You know, I don't know that I would actually be able to function at all afterwards. So it's a risk, and it's scary, but it's also something that is irrevocable. It's part of who you are. Like, you can't change what your experiences have ever been, whether they're manic or not. They always inform who you are, right? Does that answer a question? I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, I wrote a book about it, so I sort of, now I can't escape it. It's always there. But I also, like, yes and no, it's part of my identity. Like, I am who I am, and all of this happened, and all of this is who I am.
On that note, if you'll stay one more moment as I thank each of the three of our panelists. So, of course, Jaime, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Oh,
thanks.
So I'd just like to say thank you, Jaime, because you really took the darkest of moments and turned your harrowing experience into such exquisite writing and a work of art that is really healing. And so thank you for that.
Thanks.
And Julie, thank you so much for your expertise as a moderator and your vulnerability and sharing your own experience. Thank you for being here. And lastly, I think you'll all agree with me, Dr. D'Antonio, you are a gift to the profession. We are so lucky to have you. I think, of course, because of your clinical acumen, but the humanity and dignity for which you stay present through the treatment is just unsurpassed. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you for coming.